So welcome everyone to the Fall 2021 Refugees Seminar Series. Today we have the pleasure of having Professor Nugent talking about activism from exile and how activists abroad influence politics back home. Professor Nugent is an assistant professor of political science at Yale University. She is the author of After Repression, How Polarization Derails Democratic Transition, published by Princeton University Press in 2020. Her research explores the political psychology of religion and repression in the Middle East and has been published or is forthcoming in the American Journal of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, Journal of Conflict Resolution, Proceeding of the National Academy of Science, and World Politics. Professor Nugent holds a doctorate in politics from Princeton University, as well as a Bachelor in Arts in Arabic and a Master in Arts in Arabic Studies, both from Georgetown University. She previously was a postdoctoral research fellow in the Middle East Initiative at Harvard Kennedy School of Government Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. So this is a hybrid seminar. We have attendees both in the Lutz Center and in Zoom. So Professor Nugent, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me in Lutz, and to everyone else who's joining online. I really appreciate the program. Over the last 2 years that I've been working on this project, it's obviously been quite interrupted by the pandemic, and the small grant that I had from the program allowed me to basically shift a lot of what I was doing to online research and online interviews, which I'll talk a little bit about during the presentation. So the broader project that I'm going to talk about today takes as its start the Arab Spring uprisings from 2011 to 2012. This is a picture from Tahrir Square, which was the epicenter of the revolution in Egypt. In my first book, I talked a lot about how essentially the revolution went wrong, right? So how it resulted in authoritarian retrenchment within 2 years. But one of the first quotes that I cite in the book is from somebody who was in Tahrir for those 18 days of protest. He describes it as being like a dream. So it felt like everything was possible. There was a sense of camaraderie with strangers and countrymen. One author describes it as liminality, right? That everything that felt like it had been established was now up for question in really positive and interesting ways. And for a brief moment in the Egyptian case, there was actually a civilian government. So from 2012 to 2013, of course, it was a Muslim Brotherhood affiliate, but there was someone who was not a military figure in charge. But as I mentioned, within 2 years, the revolution is essentially over. What I'm going to call it, and I'll define this in a couple of slides, is a defeated revolution. This gentleman here is Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. He's the current president of Egypt. In July 2013, he announced on national television that the military would be performing a coup, removing the democratically elected president from office. He then won re-election twice with kind of the standard 94, 97% of the vote in a pretty regular authoritarian election. Since then, he's overseen a retrenchment of authoritarianism that's much worse than what his predecessors oversaw. So in the first year after the coup, there were 40,000 people that were arrested, most affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. Since then, that number has grown to 100,000, probably 60,000 of those are political prisoners. And beyond that, Sisi has recently reached his constitutional term limit, and so he pushed through new amendments to not only allow him to stay in power through 2030, but also institutionalizing military rule in the country. So Egypt, even though this is obviously a very heartbreaking and sad story, it's also not an anomalous story. So most revolutions fail, right? 2 out of 3 since 1900 to 2014. There have been 345 revolutionary episodes. 2/3 of those have failed, right? Only 123 have actually resulted in meaningful political, economic, or social change. And what's interesting is that despite its prevalence, right, this is the modal outcome, we know very little about what happens afterwards. We know a lot about successful revolutions. The literature tends to focus on these. They're interesting, and they're particularly unique in certain ways. So what I'm going to talk about today is a new book project and a related paper on taking as its inspiration kind of what has happened in Egypt over the last 10 years. So I am particularly interested in how activists experience defeated revolution and then how it affects their subsequent political behavior. I'm going to start by giving you an overview of my book, tentatively titled Exiles, How Activists Abroad Influence Politics Back Home. What I'm going to do in this is kind of conceptualize what defeated revolution is for activists. These are people who are acutely aware of what's going on. They're also involved with both planning and executing revolutions. What I'm going to argue is that a combination of experiences and the context that they end up in. As you'll see in the case of Egypt, most activists who are not in jail are now in exile. This has quite a profound impact on whether they continue to be active as activists and the nature of that activism. And as I mentioned, I'm going to focus mostly on Egyptian exiles, though Syrian, Iraqi, and Libyan exiles come up as an interesting comparison case. Then I'm going to talk about a related but standalone co-authored paper with Alex Siegel at the University of Colorado Boulder. She really is the expert for dealing with Arabic language digital data. What we do here is look at a specific case of protests in Egypt in September 2019, where exiles were extremely influential in introducing and then amplifying information that then resulted in pretty significant protests. So what comes after defeated revolution? This is kind of the big question that I'm interested in this book. I have a quote up here that hopefully you can see online as well. Just read it. This is from Sara Higazi, the late Egyptian activist. She said, as Saint just said, those who make half a revolution dig their own graves. It is literally not just figuratively true. Most of us are now in the grave, in prison, or in exile. Sara was a communist activist who died by suicide following a pretty terrible ordeal. She waved an LGBTQ pride flag at a Shura concert in Cairo, resulted in her being arrested, tortured. The PTSD that she suffered from was pretty acute. She ended up in exile in Osho, Canada. So what is the experience like for activists? There are some obvious ways that we can think about this. First, there's a decrease in the quality of democracy in Egypt, right? There was this 1-year civilian rule. There were 2 years of elections. There were 2 years of liberalization. So activists will experience this, right, as a decrease in that quality. There's disappointment about politics, right? If you remember that first quote I just showed you at the beginning, it felt like a dream. It felt like everything was possible. Life was going to change significantly, both politically, socially, economically, personally. A number of people that I talked to for this project have had major falling outs with family and friends in ways that also, speak to the personal aspects of defeated revolution. In addition, especially in the case of Egypt, the instability that the revolution introduced and then its defeat exacerbated, these folks are going to be exposed to economic decline. But most importantly, and this is why I told you Sara's backstory, at a moment of defeated revolution, the state is going to be quite defensive, right? They're reestablishing themselves. What's happened is that activists are those that are targeted most acutely by state repression. As I mentioned, 100,000 have been arrested, 60,000 of those are political prisoners. Countless have been disappeared into the system. Their lawyers and their families can't find them. What I'm going to focus on here is this group of individuals who have been exiled. So there's potentially tens of thousands who have been exiled. This is, a form of coerced migration that functions in a way that's very similar to repression. So before I get too much further, let me define a couple of terms just so we're all on the same page here. So first, the way that I think of revolution is a mass siege of established government involving competing claims to sovereignty, which aims to displace the incumbent regime and substantially alter the established order. Now, scholars will often differentiate between political revolutions, right, where the established order that's being changed is political. My interlocutors really think of political, social, and economic changes going together. So the established order here is kind of society at large. What I mean by defeated revolution is when this process doesn't happen, right? So the competing centers of sovereignty emerge, the way Tilly talks about this. There's a revolutionary situation, there's a potential for change, and it doesn't result in the final instance in meaningful change to the established order. I think of this a bit differently than other scholars of political science do. Often there's a focus on kind of the sequence or process through which revolutions emerge, or the structural predecessors that determine whether or not a revolution is successful eventually. What I'm thinking about this as is a participatory experience. So something that happens to activists, not necessarily something that they do, or something that they do. Second, activists. This is a definition I take from Yusuf El-Shazli, an individual with long-term involvements in the form of collective protest action in the context of movements, groups, or campaigns that were structured to at least some extent. Two parts that I want to highlight here. So first, long-term involvements is an important thing. Activists are people who think of activism as a political behavior that they use, not just in the revolutionary situation that I just referred to, but as a way of contesting politics more broadly. In the case of Egypt, this means that they're not just active in 2011. They're active before 2011 and they're active since. Second, this definition speaks to the collective, right? So individual protest is very interesting, but it's hard to generalize, it's hard to observe. Here, being involved in movements, groups, unions, organizations, things that are, collective entities is really important for thinking about somebody as being an activist. And then finally, exile. This is one of the key terms in the book project. So as I mentioned, it results from coerced migration. Regimes use this as a political punishment, right, for political behavior. It's very similar to other logics in terms of why regimes use it, right? So the idea here is to demobilize individuals, fracture the opposition, make anti-regime mobilization unsuccessful and ineffective. One thing that's become very obvious in my research is that this is a difficult thing to sometimes pin down in terms of one thing that happens to people or one kind of migration status that exiles hold. So the way I talk about this in the book is that there are both explicit and formal forms of exile, and then implicit and informal forms of exile. So with explicit and formal, here the focus is going to be on revocation of citizenship, a travel ban. With informal, it's much more, the regime shows up at your house in the form of the police, makes it very evident that you're no longer a protected citizen. Less formal, but still, just as potentially scary. An additional thing that I've found in some of my research is that often exiles will also talk about the decline in the quality of politics and economics in Egypt as a reason for why they've left. So I'm trying to think about how that might also be a regime strategy or a tactic of kind of wanting people to leave. So where have Egypt's activists gone since 2011? Both of these graphs, this and the next one, are inflows and then asylum claims to OECD countries. As you can see, 2011 is going to be this dotted line. This is the year of the revolution. 2013 is about here. So these are major events. First the revolution, then the coup. In the decade prior to the revolution, there were about 239,000 Egyptian migrants to OECD countries. That number grows to 339,000 after. And we can see an even bigger spike here, right? So before the revolution, about 13,000 Egyptians had applied for asylum in OECD countries. The 10 years after the revolution, 116,000 had applied for asylum. So significant numbers, particularly after 2011. That's kind of interesting, right? I mean, in a case like Syria, the revolution has led to a civil war, the security context has declined. we might expect a graph like this. And in fact, the numbers are quite large, but Egypt hasn't become any less safe in terms of national security in the last 10 years. So there's clearly something politically motivated going on here. From my qualitative evidence and my interviews with activists, the one thing that I've uncovered is that the demographics of migrants have changed over the last 10 years. So the Brotherhood, its activists, its supporters, its leaders, those who weren't arrested, left 2013 essentially as the coup is happening and on. In 2014, the Sisi regime, having more or less dealt with the Brotherhood in both legal and repressive ways, starts to look at the rest of the active opposition and starts to target non-Islamist activists. And they start to leave in larger numbers starting in 2014, and then again in 2018, right around the elections. What's been interesting is watching kind of these cells of activists popping up in different locations over the last 10 years. There are certain Western destinations in Germany. We have Berlin. In the US, there's New York City and Washington, DC. There's also places, closer to the region, including Doha and Istanbul. Interestingly, there are 3 interesting cells of exiles in Italy, Milan, Korea and Seoul, and Lebanon, Beirut. This has to do with the ease with which Egyptians can travel to these places. They don't need visas to go into these countries. And particularly in Seoul, this was an early hub. And since the migration restrictions have actually been put down, so there's not as many people migrating there. So the broader question I'm asking in this project is, what's been interesting is watching how activism does or doesn't change once people left the country, right? So first, what influences whether activists continue to be activists in exile? And second, what influences that form, right? What they're doing as activism. As a first choice, right? So here we have activism, we have our activists who are then being exiled. In the first order, they have kind of 3 main choices, right? Do they cease to be activists? That's individual demobilization. They leave the movement, they leave activism. Do they convert? This is the term that I use here, right? Do they start to mobilize on other issues? Concrete example of this might be Egyptian activists exiled in Berlin who start to work on migration issues in Germany or the Green Movement, right? So no longer focused on domestic issues in Egypt. If they continue, right, to mobilize on Egyptian-based domestic issues, they have then 3 main behavioral choices. Do they work as an activist to prepare the movement for regime change down the road, or do they take a more combative approach, right? Either promoting bottom-up regime change through supporting networks back home on the ground, or promoting top-down regime change by lobbying their new host governments in their new countries. In theorizing how they make these decisions, I think both a combination of individual and contextual factors come into play, but at different times during the decision process. So in terms of individual factors, I think this is really important for that first decision, right? Whether or not you continue in activism, convert that activism, or cease to be an activist. Here, looking at some of the literature and the biographical effects of activism, we see that the length of activism matters, right? So people who joined activism before 2011 tend to be much more committed in ways that suggest they're going to continue even after they leave their country. The existence of personal networks back home, right? Can the regime literally, repress your family even though you're no longer part of kind of the domestic sphere? Experiences of repression can go one of 2 ways. So some people who experienced repression and torture as a result of the defeat of the revolution, they're galvanized, right? They're angry. The parts of their identity for which they were repressed, right, are stronger and more mobilizing. For other people, they have real trauma, right, real PTSD in ways that prevent them from being an activist. And then finally, I consider 2 demographic conditions. So first, class and education, right? So do you have the literal resources that you need to continue to be an activist, particularly when it's very difficult? And second, are you in a phase of life where you may be working on other things, right? Education or even having children. This in the American literature is particularly important for why people individually demobilize from activism. In terms of the contextual factors, I look at three things. So first, regime type, right? Is this a democracy where people have the ability to lobby their representatives, have their preferences accounted for in policies? What are the relationships like between the new host country and the home country? You'll see in my cases, right, there's a very big difference between the United States, Germany, and Turkey in terms of their relationship with Egypt. And then finally, thinking about migration, right, the extent to which migrants have essentially assimilated, right, which has to do with the number of migrants, how they're treated, whether or not there are other similar migrants who are treated similarly to them, in this case, Arab and Muslim migrants, matters for whether or not they're going to keep mobilizing on domestic issues back home or issues related to the new host country. So putting this all together, this is the data that I'm working with. It's a mixed methods project. Much of this has been delayed by COVID, but I'm hopeful that it's going to get done in 2022. As I mentioned, the program's funding allowed me to complete a data set of Egyptian migration, a data set of travel bans and arrests in Egypt under the Sisi regime, and also to keep translating and transcribing my semi-structured interviews, which I was able to continue to do over Zoom for the last 18 months. So just a couple of notes on some preliminary findings. These two gentlemen were both administrators of the We Are Khaled Saeed Facebook page. This was an extremely important Facebook page that organized the protests in 2011. On the top, we have Wa'el Ghani. On the bottom, we have Abdurrahman Mansour. Both of them have experienced coerced migration. They were both arrested, tortured. Both of them have experienced having family members pressured by the regimes. They reacted in very different ways. So Wa'el on the top, he now lives in San Francisco. He's really no longer what we might call an activist. He does do some individual mobilization, but he's disconnected from the networks of people that he worked with before. He's had a couple of very public, sad, meltdowns, I guess you would call them. And he now works in the tech industry. Abdurrahman remains very networked. He's now living in New York City. Continues to very quietly mobilize among both the German and the American networks of exiles. And then to speak a little bit about the importance of context. Now in the United States, there's been an interesting development of the Egypt Human Rights Caucus. This is led by, in Congress, it's Don Beyer and Tom Malinowski, I believe, from Virginia and New Jersey. Here, activists have been working on forming this caucus to talk about things like human rights and military aid to Egypt. So it's very specific, right? We're not talking about regime change here. And that has very much to do with the nature of the relationship between Egypt and the United States. It's also shaped by the political opportunity structure, right? So here, they formed a caucus. They're lobbying the government because that's how politics works in the United States. In the case of Germany, you see a much more diffuse, less organized, less hierarchical structure. There tends to be a lot of cross-pollination. Berlin has a huge Syrian exile population. And so you see Egyptians working on kind of pan-Arab issues. This is a protest that Egyptians worked with Palestinians to mobilize on these issues. There's some mobilization in terms of lobbying the government or testifying in front of the government on certain issues, but it tends to be much more diffuse, much more focused on kind of what we would call traditional activism. So now I want to get into the co-authored paper with Alex Siegel. In this case, we're going to be looking at specifically protests in Egypt in 2019 and how exiles participated in introducing and mobilizing these protests. The broader question we're asking is, how do exiles participate in contentious politics back home in the digital age? And to theorize this, we draw on three sets of literature and some of their central concepts. So first, we think of the internet as extending the domestic sphere abroad, right? So this is a place in which, there's a transnational sense of political identity. Exiles who are no longer physically located within the country can continue to be in contact and even deepen certain kinds of connections with people back home. And it essentially allows political exiles to have agency, right? To have some kind of autonomy in influencing domestic politics. Second, kind of rely on the canonical models of how we think about people and how they join, right, costly protest mobilization, to think about what the internet might be doing similarly to these classic models. So we know in the individual models of protest mobilization that information provision is extremely important, right? So learning that lots of other people support an oppositional position makes it less costly for the individual to join. What we're thinking about here is digital information provision. And here, this, again, speaks to the classic models, but we're talking about essentially when something goes viral online, right? So when things are posted by multiple people in a way that suggests that, lots of people support it. This is important for authoritarian regimes in a way that it may be less important for democratic regimes, right? So online is slightly more free, at least in the context of Egypt. It may be the kind of place where engaging with oppositional information, here meaning critical of the regime, signals something, right, about how popular an oppositional position is. And then finally, we think that exiles might actually have quite a unique role to play in digital information cascade. So as you saw, exiles obviously are all located outside of the country. Some of them are located in democratic contexts where they have relatively more impunity, right, to be posting oppositional information and doing so, over time and kind of in excess in a way that had they been in the country, they might have been repressed or censored in some way. To think about how this whole process works, we draw on the communications literature to talk about three different kinds of social media users. So first, influencers. These are the users that seed new content. They make memes, they make hashtags. In this case, they also make videos. Some of the literature refers to them as idea starters. Then there's amplifiers. These are, as the literature calls them, the fire hose of knowledge. They're doing all the, for lack of a better word, amplification, right, of this information. So taking the content, making it go viral. These are extremely important users because they're often very active. They'll do things like, in the case under consideration here, right, they're going to retweet at a high rate. They're going to add people to the conversations and connect people. Then finally, we have consumers. In our theory, these are also going to end up being the protest participants. Some of the literature calls these people lurkers, right? They consume content, they look at content, they might be on the internet quite a bit, but they're not doing a lot of public engagement, right? They might not be retweeting or liking information in a way that we can capture publicly. What we think, going into this and what we in fact find is that exiles are particularly influential when they are influencers introducing that new information and when they're amplifying it as well because of the relative impunity that they can act with. But it's really important, that there is overlap in the amplifier and consumer categories with domestic users, right? Otherwise, it's just an exilic mobilization, an exilic movement. So the case that we're going to be talking about comes from September 2019 in Egypt. This is Muhammad Ali. He, in this video, is located in Spain in self-exile. Prior to leaving Egypt, he had worked for 15 years as a contractor for the Egyptian military in construction. He had also worked as an actor, which will become important for thinking through some of our generalizability from this case. In his videos, which he starts posting on September 2nd, 2018, he calls out the current regime for corruption. He called out two major generals by name. They had been in charge of the Armed Forces Engineering Authority. He claims that he's owed 220 million Egyptian pounds. And he talks about all this corruption that he experienced, right? The Sisi regime has been spending quite a bit of money constructing a new capital, constructing these villas for the military on the Red Sea. And so he's speaking to this, right? He witnessed firsthand quite a bit of corruption. The president actually responds to him after a full week of videos. And in the hours after that response happens, Muhammad Ali, this gentleman right here, posts a number of videos and kind of shifts from being specifically focused on corruption to calling for wider protests, broader issues of corruption and repression. He posts videos from a number of long-term activists, so a Sinai activist and also a former army officer and lawyer who now works in human rights. He's also reposting a lot of videos that are coming from both masked and unidentified individuals claiming to be members of the armed forces who support the claims that he's making. I should note they all get channeled through Ali's account in a way that makes it really helpful for us to basically track how this process unfolds over time. So the first protests happen on, sure.
Yeah, just a quick question. So does Muhammad Ali have lots of family back in Egypt that could presumably been threatened by the regime?
He has some. He has some. I know after all this kind of plays out, he's also, there's pressure that's put on him in Spain as well. Then I can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A. But I should just note, so he has both a YouTube account where he's posting these videos. He has a Twitter account where he's retweeting this content. And then he also spreads most of these things on Facebook through different hashtags. So these are our main protests. So the protests started on the 20th, the 21st, and then the 27th. The 27th are going to be the largest ones. The regime responds in two ways to these moments of mobilization. So first, they flood the streets with police, especially major squares where these groups tend to congregate and start protests. They arrest 4,321 individuals as a result of participating in these protests. They also use Twitter's reporting mechanism to shut down Ali's account. I'll be able to show you that in a couple of slides from now. And up to 150 accounts of related activists who are highly engaged with his content. So to figure out what's going on here, right? How do Exiles, this Muhammad Ali and those that interact with him, how do they introduce information that then mobilizes protests? We use a method called process tracing. So this is the analysis of diagnostic evidence, kind of a preponderance of evidence from processes, sequences, and conjunctures of events within a single case. And process tracing is particularly good for looking at the specific causes of specific outcomes. In this case, what we do is look at the introduction of information, the amplification of information, the consumption of information, and our last analysis is going to break that down at a very fine-grained subnational level in a way that suggests this information consumption predicts protest mobilization at a very local level. The digital data we have both captures public and private engagement with this content. Facebook, we're going to have data from public Facebook pages, community pages. Google Trends is more of a private way to think about engagement with this content. It's basically search trends that are disaggregated by location. Twitter allows us to, again, get at kind of public engagement. So are people adding Muhammad Ali? Are they retweeting? Are they liking? And finally, YouTube is, again, a bit more private, right? So when you think about likes and dislikes that you can post on a YouTube page, that's more public. But there's also information about just viewing a video that we have. The non-digital data that we use here is from Daftar al-File. It's a Cairo-based organization that does real-time data collection on contentious events. So first, thinking about our influencer. As I mentioned, he starts on September 2nd, and between September 2nd and November 1st, which is our period of analysis, he posts between 1 and 7 videos a day. They're a bit front-ended, but he's very active throughout this period. He started a Twitter account the same day he posted his first video, and so he goes from having literally 0 followers to excuse me, this is the number of tweets, right? So he starts from having very few tweets to producing almost 6,000 by the time this period is over. There are different moments when you can figure out, right, that the regime is starting to interfere. Some of these early ones, every time there's a vertical line, right, a tweet has been deleted. Some of these early ones are Muhammad Ali censoring himself. These are much more likely, based on secondary information, to be the regime shutting down his account. Here is his follower count. So as I mentioned, he starts with very few followers. By the time of the first protest, he has 250,000 followers. So he's becoming central, very influential within certain networks of activists in a way where he's the central node. And we can see this happening here. Now to turn to the amplifiers. Here we have Twitter data that we collected in real time. And we're able to see, first of all, that these trends in terms of engagement, again, either retweeting or adding, literally, replying or tagging him, it corresponds with the protests as they're happening. We also disaggregate it by users who are located inside of Egypt and outside of Egypt. What you can see here is that the rates of engagement inside Egypt, at least in this measurement, right, are higher overall. And consistently so than outside of Egypt. What we do next to understand kind of the top amplifiers is take the 100 top engagers. We manually code whether or not they're located in Egypt, outside of Egypt, what their nationality is, and then what their profession is or what sector they worked in, depending or relying on kind of information that they post in their own Twitter bios. A lot of people will link to a LinkedIn page or a professional website. So from this, and I should note, the nodes will appear larger if they're central, right? So if they're being engaged quite a bit. Here, this is Muhammad Ali's account. So what you can see here is that the top amplifiers, right, even though I just showed you that most of the engagement is coming from inside of Egypt, the top amplifiers are located outside of Egypt. So they're doing a lot of this amplification that matters. Second, they're Egyptian. So they're Egyptians that are located outside of the country, again, suggesting that there's this transnational political sphere where these things are being spread. And that matters, right? I mean, it makes them much more credible in terms of why they would be interested in this information, why they would be spreading it. Finally, when we look at kind of the actor type, what we find is that there are a number of media personalities that are extremely influential and active in terms of amplifying Muhammad Ali's content, right? And these individuals, when we looked into the data, tend to be part of the anti-Sisi independent media based in Turkey. This will become important in just a couple of slides. These are particularly influential kinds of users, right? They are deemed credible. They're semi-celebrities in ways that matter for, again, the spread of information. There's also high numbers of politicians in exiles, activists and academics, all of whom are in exile outside of the country. Finally, one more slide here on thinking through amplification. As I mentioned, Muhammad Ali used hashtags that called not only for being anti-regime, but also for specific protests. Here, we can see that, again, inside and outside Egypt are engaging these hashtags at very similar rates. And it corresponds with some of the larger protests. So this is going to be September 27th. There's a huge spike similar to here. Again, suggesting, right, that this information matters for mobilization. Finally, turning to consumers, as I mentioned, these are most likely to be the protesters in our story. We start with YouTube data. September 2nd is when these videos are going to be posted. There's a huge spike initially, almost 500,000 views in one day. There's also an interesting backlash effect. So by October 15th, the Egyptian state has stepped in, really shut down protests. Doesn't seem to make the content any less popular. And I should say that in this period of analysis, there's 3.3 million views. So this is a pretty viral video. We also see, these numbers are not going to be anywhere near a majority of people watching this content, but when people publicly engage with it, they tend to be more positive, right? So they're liking the video on YouTube at a much higher rate than they are disliking. And again, these trends kind of correlate not only with protests, but with views more generally. Now, the most difficult part of what we're trying to do here is linking information consumption with protest behavior. That's something obviously happens at an individual level. It's kind of hard to capture. So what we try to do is first we break it down by governorate. So this is the Google Trends data, again, much more of a private approach to thinking about people engaging with this content. We see relative interest concentrated in the Red Sea governorate, Kina, Damietta, Cairo, and Giza. Yes. What I can say is that outside of the Red Sea governorate, which for various reasons is highly policed, this is where most of the tourism in Egypt happens. The Red Sea is also important, so it's very highly policed. Everywhere but the Red Sea saw the largest number of protests, between 3 and 11 in the period under analysis. But we want to think about this on a much more fine-grained level. So what we do is look at the protest data. Everywhere that more than one protest happened is listed here. So these are our most active spaces. And it's interesting, they're in Suez and Cairo, which are highly urban, but they're also, in the middle of nowhere, Egypt. What we do is match these districts, akin essentially to an American county, with districts that are the same in terms of level of urbanness. Morsi vote in 2012, so something about opposition to the state or anti-Islamist, and population. But they don't have any protest. What we do then is find public Facebook pages. You might be familiar with these. These are community pages where people tend to talk about things like schools and potholes and broken streetlights. What we do is scrape it to see if they're talking about any of this, right, at a very local level. And we find that they're talking about the oppositional content in very different ways. So the blue here is going to be places where protests occurred. The pink is going to be places where they did not occur. What we see here is that places where protests occurred talked about Muhammad Ali's oppositional content, posted it, discussed it prior to the start of protests. And then they stopped talking about it. And we think there's some kind of repressive backlash there where they're no longer willing to talk about something that is potentially costly. In the non-protest areas, they only talk about that content after protest. So they're learning something, about this oppositional content from likely, nationwide news coverage of these events. So we think of this, in the qualitative literature as much more of a smoking gun to say there is something about local information consumption of this oppositional information that matters for whether or not you see protests or whether or not you're learning about that information later. So just to recap, here Exiles in our story are really important for introducing and amplifying information. They contribute to information cascades, which are so important for getting people to protest, but they don't lead interest, right? You'll remember in all of the graphs, there was more online engagement from domestic users than exilic users. Finally, we show that there's, at a very fine-grained level, a correlation between local protests and local consumption of this oppositional information. As I mentioned, there may be two things that are somewhat specific to this case, although we're only looking at Egypt. It would certainly be worth thinking about Egypt in comparative perspective. The influencer is not only credible, right? He, as the kids say, has receipts from having been personally involved in being an army contractor. He's not partisan. So in a place like Egypt, being identified as either an Islamist or non-Islamist in meaningful ways might have made the information, less credible to lots of people. On the other side, he emphasizes throughout his videos his blue-collar background, right? So he's kind of an everyman in this situation. And then, as I mentioned, he had also worked as a celebrity. So he's very polished, he's very charismatic. His videos are shot, kind of in like a selfie style, but they're very polished, right? Second, because he works in the entertainment industry, he seems to have a lot of followers who are in the media and the entertainment sectors. And in the literature, even in the United States, right, people tend to be bored of politics. They don't like politics. Celebrities can get people excited about politics. And so he has a high number of these people who are considered to be icons in the communications literature that are retweeting, especially early, his work. Okay, so to bring it back to kind of a higher level, what I'm hoping to do here is think about the micro-foundations of both revolution and defeated revolution, as well as democratization. So quite a few of the activists that I am talking about in both the paper that I'm working on with Alex and in the book, these are people who not only planned and executed the revolution, but they continued it to the extent that it continued beyond 2011. And the political science literature has talked a lot about how there are biographical effects of having participated in movements. Here, I'm interested in this concept of, how does participating in a revolution and then a defeated revolution affect the rest of your life, right? For many of these people, it happened in their early 20s. They still have a long time, to kind of grapple with the effects, and it's completely understudied in the literature. Second, I'm interested in kind of, and I'm doing this in other projects as well with one of our colleagues here, Dan Mattingly. Coerced migration is a very interesting form of migration. And we've spent a lot of time in political science thinking about transnational repression, right? What regimes are doing to kind of punish activists beyond their borders. But we think less about how this is kind of inadvertently creating transnational opposition. And so we want to think a little bit more critically about that, how the way in which regimes use coerced migration, if they use coerced migration, shapes opposition in ways that has important effects on domestic politics. And then finally, perhaps a bit hopefully, because I know a lot of this has not been particularly hopeful, the folks that are currently located outside of Egypt who are doing things like introducing oppositional information and mobilizing protests will likely be a source of democratization in the future, right? Most of the Arab Spring uprisings did not result in meaningful democratization. They very much resulted in increased authoritarianism. As a result, most of the open space for contestation is now outside of the country. So just like 2010 to 2011, the Arab Spring uprisings, relied on decades of people working as activists, I think any kind of future democratization will too. And in the case of the Arab Spring, right, like where we are now with regards to repression, likely those activists are going to be the ones located outside of the country. So with that, I will say thank you. Thank you again to the program for helping me to continue this research over the last year and a half.
You're welcome. So
What do I do now?
no, you keep like that. So if people from the audience would like to ask questions now, I'll pass them to Professor Nugent.
Yeah, Drew.
Yeah, so I have two questions. So the first is sort of a question regarding the framing or the types of cases that your analysis applies to. And I was wondering whether this just applies to exile in the context of defeated revolution, or if it's broadly applicable to any setting where perhaps there's like extreme democratic backsliding. So I was thinking particularly in the case of Turkey, but then also in settings where one side is defeated in a civil war and individuals are forced to go abroad, but still there's some attempt to try and influence politics back home. So I was wondering sort of the extent to which you think your argument applies to those settings, like revolutionary settings in particular, or whether it can apply to a broader set of settings. And then the second question I have is regarding sort of the diagram that you had where individuals abroad sort of have these choices to either remain active in sort of politics back home as exiles, or just change to some other kind of political activism or just disengage altogether.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering the extent to which individuals kind of change, like sort of shift between those modes of behavior. But overall, really fascinating project.
Hey, should I answer? Okay. Yeah. So your first question is a really interesting one because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, of the 345 revolutionary situations that don't, so 123 of them are successful, right? Meaning they result in democratization in a meaningful way. The rest of them fail in lots of different ways, right? So some become civil wars, some just go back to the same authoritarianism, some go back to worse authoritarianism. My case, Killian Clark has done some really interesting work on this concept of counter-revolution. Egypt, and I think he's right on this, although I think the concept of defeated revolution can apply to a lot of different things. He calls it counter-revolution, where you actually did have a civilian government, right, or a change in the old guard in a meaningful way. And I think he says that there's 22 cases of that, where you have meaningful change in government and then a reversal. So I think at the very least, it applies to those 22 cases. Some of the other cases that I'm looking at in the book, so Iraq, you end up with exiles before, like basically under Saddam Hussein. That's not necessarily the result of a failed revolution. In Libya, you also, part of that is, there are moments of kind of civil war. There's also moments of just high repression. In Syria, it's a defeated revolution that has become a civil war. So it's not exactly, it's both, right? That you can't kind of separate that both of these things are related. So I'm trying to think about defeated revolution as a broad category, that then there would be lots of different ways that revolutions are failing. And in terms of that graph, I think there probably is some switching. And at this point, it's been interesting to see over the last 10 years how people have evolved in their stance, right? So people who have gone from thinking that revolution is pointless to thinking, okay, well, now the revolution must be global instead of local. It does seem like most folks who decide to cease being an activist stay out of politics. That's not the case for every single person, but for the most part, they're making choices based on personal decisions, right? Their children or their family needing to go back to school, financial necessity. Or they've experienced such a terrible form of repression that they're unable to keep being active politically. There is more, I don't know if it's flip-flopping or changing within people who continue to be active on domestic issues and those who start to think about things as a broader issue. But it's pretty clear when someone's saying, okay, I'm mobilizing on, the cause of political detainees in Egypt versus political detainees and, thinking about this in Egypt, right? The way in which they talk about it does differentiate between whether they're thinking about it as a broad category or if it's in Egypt specifically, this is the issue. So yeah, I think there's more overlap in those two categories as people, frankly come to terms with, are they going to be staying in their new location for longer? What else is happening in their life? Are there new focal points, right, around which they could be bringing the Egyptian issue into the Green Movement or into the migration movement? Some of it's a bit strategic in terms of that as well. Nick.
Thanks. So I had two questions, one for each part. So for the first part of the talk, I was curious so you mentioned Weil and Abdurrahman taking different paths in their activism. And I was wondering if you had a sense of why their paths diverged. And you mentioned trauma, and I know they were both exposed to trauma, but I'm not sure if you have any insight on why their paths might have taken such different trajectories. And then the second question that I had is, you mentioned transnational repression and how Mo Ali was sort of shut down eventually. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how exilic opposition activism differs from activism at home, if you are still at the mercy of transnational repression, if your family members can be targeted by the regime. Why is it just like an oversight that the regime didn't notice these people, but then once they pop up, they get shut down? Or, I feel like there could be some dynamic there strategically that would be interesting to think about.
Yeah, these are great questions. So in terms of the individual variation, I think in the case of Wael and Abdurrahman, obviously, people are quite idiosyncratic, but I think in this case, it had to do with their individual reactions to trauma and repression. So they had very similar experiences. I think one of them, kind of as a result had really terrible PTSD, resulted in kind of a crumbling of both his personal and professional and political life. The other one, channeled it in different ways. So I think that's probably what's explaining that variation. Second, right, so this idea of transnational repression, this goes to your question too. So initially, they're not directly repressing Muhammad Ali. They do shut down his account. Every time there was kind of those vertical spikes, you can see that either things are being deleted or the account is being shut down. So I think online transnational repression is particularly interesting because it's essentially costless for a regime. The other kinds of transnational repression that I was referring to in the case of Ali is that they pressure some of his family back home, and then the Egyptian state has been investing in kind of its overseas repression or surveillance. They've been beefing up the intelligence collection at their embassies, and what Ali claims in some later videos is that he is being trailed, by an Egyptian agent. So I think there's a couple of things. I think the fact that Sisi responded to him made him more credible, right? We see the spikes. There's clearly a reaction. And I think he did so because the information that Ali was putting out was particularly damning. Although, that was probably a badly calculated risk, right? Had he ignored it, maybe it wouldn't have gone viral the way it did. I think regimes make mistakes on these things. They either don't notice or they think it's not that big a deal. I think once the 27th happened, those were pretty large protests, particularly in a country right now where it's highly repressive. After that, I think you see the regime then say, okay, we really need to squash this, both in terms of a physical presence and shutting down those accounts, and trailing Ali. So, in some ways, right, this time period's not that long. It's between September 2nd and September 27th, right, where we get introduction of information and then major protests. So I guess they're moving as quickly as they can. That might be part of it too.
Thank you.
I have actually a question as well. So it's regarding the ability of the regime to shut down the way that the activists sort of communicate. So some of these, I imagine that they use some of the, so Facebook, WhatsApp. So is there like any pressure on these companies, both inside and outside, to just shut down whatever the regime is not liking? And what would be also the reaction for the activists themselves, maybe to transfer, to use another way of communicating that cannot be sort of surveyed the same way?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the first, right? So the pressure on the company is so in this case, they shut down, they use on Twitter, if you're familiar with Twitter, you can report content, right? For various reasons, it's offensive or it's politically inflammatory. It seems like what the regime did was flag Arabic language content said it was inflammatory. Twitter immediately removed those accounts and that content. Eventually, I don't really know what goes on behind the scenes, but eventually it was reviewed and they found that it wasn't actually politically inflammatory. And so they reinstated the accounts. There was also, a couple of Twitter threads where people were collecting names of people who had been targeted. So then there was a sense of, okay, all these people were tweeting about this thing, right? That's not politically inflammatory. It's just oppositional information. And there was an investigative report done by a journalist outside of the country. And I think I have another graph here of one additional thing, in addition to shutting down the accounts, the Egyptian state, let's see. Nope, I don't have it. They are able to basically make certain websites unavailable. And you can see access to Twitter and Facebook. If I had the graph, you could see it's basically limited by 20 to 30% at different moments. So they're able to do it on a couple different levels. But this investigative journalist demonstrated it wasn't because they were saying something like, use violence or whatever. It was really, they were just retweeting this information. And I do think, what I really enjoy about our paper is that we're able to use sources from a bunch of different platforms or data from a number of different sources. We do see that these things are happening in tandem, right? So there's a lot of the information cascade is happening across different platforms. Obviously, there's also secret ways to talk about this stuff, WhatsApp and Signal. They're obviously doing that as well. It's just harder to find public data on that kind of stuff. There's been some interesting papers on also Telegram and Clubhouse, right? Ways that people, when the internet gets shut down, when Facebook gets shut down, when Twitter is being monitored, using Clubhouse can sometimes be an alternative to that. So they're definitely being strategic in terms of that as well.
But the regime also sort of have they sort of shut down, or do they have, what is their approach to these companies working inside the...
Yeah, I mean, this is a very timely question, I think, with some of the debates about what role is Facebook supposed to play in society generally, in a democracy, in an autocracy. For the most part, they've been fine with them existing. They just also put limitations on it. Facebook Messenger is a way that a lot of Egyptians communicate in country. I think they know it's not encrypted. There's certain things you don't say there. At different moments, I think WhatsApp has been difficult to access in the region because there's been a block on it. So the regimes, are clearly using the technology that they can to make it more difficult to do this kind of coordination. It's still easier to police a street, though, right, than to police an online platform. So that tends to be, where they're focusing their efforts.
Good. Any more questions here?
Yeah, so in the second project, the fair comparison of the districts was really interesting. And I was wondering if you happen to have, if there's data out there where you could do that same comparison, but then see if those matched districts have different levels of protest activity during the Arab Spring, 8 years earlier. And the extent to which there's been some sort of kind of longer term legacy of Arab Spring mobilization that can then sort of contribute to the sort of post-counter-revolutionary period and the propensity of people to protest, or at least maybe it's a predictor.
Yeah, I don't have that, but that's a really great suggestion. We do see that one thing we wondered was whether they were more active anyway. And there's no clear pattern here. So the protests, on average, the protest localities are slightly more active, but not significantly so in terms of just number of posts. Our measurement ends up being a percentage of total posts, but I can say that they're at least not like significantly different in terms of how much they're talking about local issues. But that would be interesting to see. This data set from the Cairo-based Data Institute does go back, quite a ways. It could be interesting to think like, are there already networks here that are being activated?
And if not, then that's really interesting because the new ones are being activated during like
a highly repressive time. Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
I mean, and just from a general interest standpoint into Egypt, like so much of the attention paid to like the Arab Spring activity in Egypt is paid to what's happening in Cairo.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just really not a ton about like what's happening in a lot of other areas in Egypt. Like, I mean, at least in sort of the like popular press, but then also in like academic literature, there's not as much.
Right. Yeah, there's Jason Brownlee, I think, has written about like the Cairo bias in Egyptian scholarship, which I think we're all guilty of, but particularly with protests, I think urban bias is absolutely the case. And in this case, a lot of these protests didn't happen in urban centers, which is interesting, right? Like that's not really the historical pattern of protests in Egypt. So yeah, I mean, is it mobilizing new networks? Is there something about, I don't know, even the way in which like the regime has been highly policing certain areas and not policing other areas, and trying to strategize and, maximize the effectiveness of their repressive, capacity. That's a really interesting question. And we'll definitely do that.
Well, and maybe because like Cairo has become such a focal point for the regime that actually opens up space for people in these smaller communities to actually organize.
Yeah. Well, and Egypt is also just a fascinating case because you have if you were to look at the distribution of population, it's a very concentrated distribution, which means there are certain ways in which the regime can police it very easily, but it's a huge country at the same time, right? And it's not like there aren't people in the countryside who are also really unhappy with what's happening. And the internet might be particularly effective at mobilizing those groups, relative to like word of mouth, right? Just based on density of population.
Yeah.
Awesome. Any more questions?
No, we don't have more questions here. So I think that's it. So thank you very much for the presentation and best of luck with the remaining of your research.
Thank you.